If you build a software application, whether that's a website, desktop app or a mobile app, you need to take a lot of decisions about how your user, your customer, is going to use your app. If you just take those decisions based on what you think will work, you're basically flying blind because you don't know what the user actually prefers, and you risk that your users are going to leave because your app doesn't deliver. Because of that, it's common practice to do A/B tests. There are 2 ingredients you need in your code to support this. I'll cover both of them today, and I'll also show you how to incorporate them in your code while keeping your software design clean. I'm also going to show you a few platforms that can be helpful, in particular Growthbook and Mixpanel, because they have a free version, so it's easy to get started with. This video is not sponsored by any of these platforms, no money changed hands, they have not been involved in the production of this video. I'm simply using these platforms as an illustration. Before running A/B tests, it's a good idea to go through your code and try to improve the design so that it's easier to switch between different setups. But how do you actually detect design issues in your code? I have a free code diagnosis workshop that teaches you a 3-factor framework that contains the main areas you should focus on. It's based on my own experience reviewing tons of code and trying to make that process more efficient and more effective. Go to arjan.codes/diagnosis to enroll. The link is also in the description of this video. In order to show you how to set up A/B tests, I'm going to use a simple text editor example today. It's called WorsePad. It's like Notepad, but worse. The example has 2 files, a main file and a GUI file. The main file is really simple. It creates an instance of WorsePad and then it runs the main GUI loop. The GUI file itself is a bit more interesting. There's a default file name that we're going to save edits to, and there's a WorsePad class that inherits from tkinter's tk object. The initializer goes, of course, the super initializer. We set a title, the size of the window, and then we create a default file path. I'm using path here from Pathlib, which is really useful. So this is the current working directory / and then the default file name, that's a constant up here. And then I create the user interface by calling create UI. And what does this do? Well, it's pretty simple. It creates a menu bar and then it adds a couple of items to the menu. Particularly, there's a file menu. So we have open, clear, save, and exit. And each of these map to a command that's a method in the class. Add command in file menu adds a menu item. So what I did is there's a tuple of labels and commands, so I don't have to call add command over and over again. So I think this just looks a bit cleaner. This wasn't my idea, by the way. This was suggested by one of the code reviewers on my channel, Joris. After creating the menu bar, there's a frame that contains a button to save the text. So that has the same behavior as clicking save in the menu bar. And there is a text box where you can edit text. Then we have a couple of methods, like on open. So this opens a file dialog, and then it reads the contents from the text file and puts it in the text box. Then we have on clear, that clears the text box, and we have on save. And that's all there's to it. If I run this, then this is what you're going to see. So it's a little, very tiny text editor. Let me make it a bit larger. And then I can type something here and then I can press save. And as you'll see in the same folder, a file called untitled.txt, which contains the contents of my text. If you use the save menu item, it's also going to ask for a file name. You can pick another file. What is an A/B test? A/B testing, also called bucket testing or split testing, is a way to compare 2 versions of a single variable. You typically test the subject's response to variant A versus variant B in order to determine which of the 2 variants is more effective. A/B testing is common practice in user experience research. Companies like Google, Meta, Twitter are running experiments with their users all the time, enabling and disabling certain features, layouts, text changes, etc., and then measuring the response of the user. These can range from switching to a whole different user interface for a subset of users to really minor things like changing the wording of a marketing text or the text or icon on a button. Often, you may not even notice that you've been part of an experiment. You've just seen something different than the regular users, and then your actions are being recorded and analyzed. Is that actually legal? You'll commonly see pretty broad phrases and privacy statements on the website about what data can be collected about you while you're browsing that website. Browsers nowadays have code that can block this kind of tracking. With desktop applications though, This is a lot harder since these are standalone. In that case, you're protected by the privacy laws of your country, which may not really protect you at all. And not all companies are upfront about what they're doing with your data. And it's not always easy to find out on your own. If you're in the EU, there's the GDPR, which is one of the strictest privacy controls out there. Customers should be able to opt out of systems that track their actions and collect data about them. They should be able to see what data is stored about them, as well as request erasing this data. In short, if you're implementing A/B tests and keep track of user data, make sure to ask permission. If you don't, you might get into legal trouble, but mostly it's just the right thing to do. In order for your code to support A/B tests, you need two things. One, you need a mechanism to provide either the A or B variety. And two, you need to define KPIs, key performance indicators, and a mechanism to record them so you can compare. A common mechanism to provide the A and B varieties is by using a feature flag. A feature flag is basically nothing more than a Boolean value that you can set to true or false, and depending on that value, you're going to display or do something different in your application. For example, suppose you want to check whether that save button is actually used by any of the users of WordPad, if there are any. In order to test that, you need to be able to enable or disable the save button. So some users will see it and other users won't. So what do we need to do? Well, the most simple thing that we can do in our application is actually add a Boolean variable that we're going to set to true or false. So to start, very simple, let's add here a show save button instance variable, and let's initially set that to true. And now, of course, the next thing that I need to do is change the UI based on the value of this variable. So in create UI, I'm going to the part where I create the save button. So that's right here. And then let me add here a section if self.show save button. And then we're going to take these two lines and indent them so that these are only executed if save button is set to true. Let me save this. Now, when I run this, obviously nothing's going to change because it's still set to true. But when I go back to my GUI file and I change this to false, like so, and when I run this again, now you see that the save button is gone. The issue is, though, we don't want our users to manually have to edit the source code of their application in order to enable or disable a feature. We want to make that a bit easier, and ultimately we want to do it automatically for certain groups of users. Now, the first step that you can take is actually move out, setting the value of something like show save button outside of the code in, for example, a configuration file. What you can do, I've already created the JSON file here that contains the same variable show save button, and it sets it in this case to true. So instead of setting it here explicitly in the GUI, we need to read it from the configuration file. And then you can distribute your application to users and provide them with different configuration files if you want to measure whether they're actually using that button. Now, there's another thing that you actually need to measure it so that you can say something about it. That's another part that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But let's first see how to handle configuration files in this case. So what I'll do is I go back to my main file, and then what we need to do here is read the configuration from the file. So in order to prepare for that, let's first create a data class where I'm going to store the configuration settings. So let's call that class config. And then let's say we have a show save button variable here. That's Boolean, and default that's going to be true. And then what we can do is read the file and create an instance of config. And I'm going to use the path object here from pathlib. Like so. And let me add a helper method, read config file. That's going to return a config object. So the config file, that's the current working directory /config.json. You could turn this into a constant that you define at the top of the file. That way it's a bit easier to find, but for simplicity, I'll just leave it in here. And then we're going to read the data. That's going to be a dictionary using JSON, which we need to import, .load as, and then we're going to provide config file .read text, which is a really useful method from pathlib that just directly reads the text from the file. This gives the dictionary of config values. And then we can simply return a config object and pass it the unpacked values in the dictionary that we just read. So in the main file, we can then read the config by calling that method. And then the next step is to pass the config settings to the worstpath instance. So in order to do that, we need to change this slightly so that the initializer actually expects settings. So we can let it have another argument, show save button, which is a Boolean. And then instead of setting it explicitly here, we're going to store the value of show save button here. And then in main, we simply pass that as an argument. Like so. Let's see what happens when we run this. Config.json has it set to true, so we expect there to be a save button now, and indeed there is. And when I change this to false, like so, and I run this again, then we're going to get a version of the text editor without the save button. So this is good. This means that we already extracted specific configuration settings out of the code and we can define it in a separate file. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, give it a like. Unless YouTube has disabled that feature for you because you're part of an A/B test. In that case, just do a happy dance or something, or sing a song. I really like using feature flags, and they're not just useful for running A/B tests. If you're using continuous integration as a development process, then you can use a feature flag to hide a feature that you're still working on. So the code is actually already published, but the feature is not active yet. You can then activate the feature by simply switching on the feature flag. In essence, you decouple the release from the deployment. In the example I just showed you, the feature flag setting was part of the code, or part of a config file. If you want to have more control over opening up features to your users, you need to store feature flag settings outside of your code, so you can change the values without having to deploy a new version of your code. You can do that in your own database. If you want to go all in though, you can also use a feature flag as a service platform. Some example platforms are LaunchDarkly, Growthbook or Flagship. They generally offer some sort of web-based interface that allows you to define feature flags, enable or disable them. You can only enable them for certain types of users. For example, users enroll in a beta program. You can do phased rollouts and slowly enable the feature over time for more users. On some platforms, you can also do measurements of how the feature is being used. Let's take a look at Growthbook as an example. Here you see what the Growthbook web interface looks like. I'm not going to go into details in all the different possibilities that you have. I just want to show you an example of how to create a feature flag and then deal with it in your code. So what you do is you click on Add First Feature, and then you can define a feature key. So that's the name of the feature flag. So let's say we have our Show Save button feature. You can add tags to organize your features. You can have different environments in which features are active or not. So this is really helpful if you have, for example, a dev environment where you want to disable different features than in the production environment. You can also specify what kind of thing it is. Is it a Boolean? Most of the case is going to be Boolean, but maybe you want to have a number to indicate. For example, if you want to test how many documents a user can open or something like that. You can also have a JSON object or a string. So this is actually really useful. And as you can see in Growthbook, you can define experiments like only rolling out a feature to a percentage, or do actually an A/B experiment between multiple values of the flag, or do a targeted segment of users that get the particular value, etc., etc. So there's already a lot possible here. So let me create the feature flag here. And now you can see that there is also, if I click on Python, there's the code that you can use to check whether the feature is on. So when we look at now the list of features, we see that there's now a feature flag Show Save button, which is currently on. So how do we use feature flags from Growthbook in our code? It's actually pretty simple. So here I have my main file again, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to reorganize this a bit so that I'm not going to read the config object from a config file, but I'm going to use Growthbook to get the values of each of the feature flags. So I'm going to copy the config class, and then I'm going to create a new file here. Let's call that feature. And then later on in the main file, I'm going to access this to read the actual features. So I'm going to paste the config class here. And of course, we need to import data class like so. And now let's create a function, read config, that just like before is going to return a config object. Now, in order to use Growthbook, you need the Growthbook package. That's a package you can install it with pip. I already did that, so I can simply import from Growthbook the Growthbook class that we're going to use for this. And so in read config, we're going to need the Growthbook API key. You can set up the API key in the Growthbook web platform, and then you can access it here. What I did, I have a .env file here that contains the API keys that I need. So there's a Mixpanel token that I'm going to show you in a minute, and there's also the Growthbook key. So since I'm reading environment variables, I'm also going to need to import the OS package. And then what I'm going to do is the API key is going to be os.getenv. Oh, no underscore. There we go. And then we're going to get Growthbook key, like so. And if it's not there, we're simply setting that to the empty string. Then what I'm going to do next is use the requests package to do an API request to get the value of my particular feature flag. So I'm going to need a request. And then I'm going to access the Growthbook API. So that's this, and then I'm going to add the API key to it, and we can also define a timeout of, let's say, 5 seconds. So then my features are going to be the response.json data, and then we get the features dictionary item, like so. Then we create the Growthbook instance, and we're going to pass the features, like so. And finally, what we can do is return a config object, and then show save button is going to be the Growthbook is on, and we want to retrieve show save button, like so. So the main reason I'm using the Growthbook object here is that it helps me parse the dictionary of features. But technically speaking, you don't really need it. You could also do this yourself if you want to. So now we have a read config function that's going to give us a config object based on the features that we get from Growthbook. So in main, I'm just going to delete this because we're no longer going to use a config file, but we're going to use read config that we're going to import from feature, like so. So a couple of things here are no longer needed, so I can just delete them. And now we're reading the feature flag value from Growthbook. So in Growthbook, currently show save button is on. Before we can run this, we need to do one more thing, which is that we need to load the .env file. Otherwise, it's not going to find the API key. So I need an import for that from .env. So that's the python.env package. I'm going to import load.env. So what load.env does is that it loads variables from a .env file, like I have here, and then turns them into environment variables that I can access in my application. So I'm just going to call load.env, like so. And now when I run this code, we're going to see that the save button is enabled because in Growthbook we enabled the feature. So let me close the application. And now in Growthbook, let's say I want to disable the feature. So I'm simply going in my web interface, so you can do this after you've deployed your application to your users. And I'm going to switch off the feature flag in the production environment. And now when I run the code again, you see that the save button is gone. So this is a really neat way of controlling which features are enabled or disabled for your users. You can do a lot more in Growthbook. You can also couple this to user ID, so only certain users get the feature enabled. You can roll out a percentage like I showed you before. There's a lot to delve into. I'm not going to do that in this video. I think that's a bit too much. But if you want me to do a video about this in more detail, let me know in the comments. So as you can see, Growthbook exposes an API. A lot of these services that do feature flag management and A/B testing, they all have APIs that you can use. So this is a RESTful API. If you want to know more about RESTful APIs and how they differ from something like GraphQL, check out this video that I did a while ago. So Growthbook allows you to run experiments and do some analysis on them. They do need to connect with another data source. That's basically the tracking tool that you're going to use. And they support different ones, Mixpanel, Snowflake. There's a couple of different sources. So what I'm going to do is show you how to use Mixpanel. I won't do the actual Growthbook integration, but I'll just show you how it works in Mixpanel so you can get started with that. But there's, of course, like you can see here, there's a lot of other options you can use as well. So now we're entering the realm of tracking what our users are doing. And like I mentioned before, it's a good thing to ask permission to your users before you start doing that. So what we can do here in the application is add a simple dialog to request whether it's okay that we're tracking the user data. So what you can do, for example, in the create UI method is to add an extra element to the user interface, which is a message box to ask a question like, do you want to share usage statistics with us? And message box is something that we need to import from tkinter. I'm not doing anything yet with result. I'll do that in a minute. So the way that tracking works in a platform like Mixpanel is that you're going to send some event data to Mixpanel about a certain thing that happened in your interface. For example, when a user clicked the save button in the interface, you can send an event to Mixpanel, hey, somebody clicked on the button. And then later on, when you've collected enough data from your users, you can see how often they're clicking on that button and whether the button is really going to be useful. And of course, you can track lots and lots of other things using Mixpanel, like whether people are going successfully through a login flow, which features they're using when, etc., etc. So it can potentially give you a lot of data. But like I said, you have to ask permission to users to collect that data. So what I did is I created another file here called event.py, which contains a simple function, post event. We're going to pass it an event type. So that's the name of the thing that we want to track. And then I'm using the Mixpanel package to connect my application with the Mixpanel tool. So this is actually really simple. Again, we need to get a token so that we have access to our Mixpanel environment. So this is from my .env file, or you can supply it in any other way you like. I'm simply writing a log message here. I could have used the logging package from Python, but I simply use print here. And then I create a Mixpanel object, and then I tell Mixpanel to send a tracking message for this particular event type. So then in my GUI, I need to make a distinction between the save menu item, which is here, that calls on save, and my save button that now also calls on save. So let's do this slightly differently. I'm going to rename this to save, which is simply the save operation. But then I'm going to add a second method that's called on, let's say, on button save. And this is going to call save, self.save, obviously. And now my button here is going to have as a command on button save, like so. So now I can do something different depending on whether I click the button or whether I click the save item in the menu. And what I'd like to do is, of course, depending on this result, I want to make sure that I'm either tracking the user or that I'm not tracking the user. So in order to support this, I'm going to add an extra variable here. Let's call that post event. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass an argument here, which is the post event function. So that's a callable, and that expects a string and is going to return none as a result. And then post event is going to be the post event function here. And then what I can do is in my create UI section here is that I can check the result. And if it's no, then I'm going to replace that function by an empty function. So if result equals no, I almost typed 3 equals there. I'm a little too much still in the JavaScript, TypeScript world. Anyway, then self.post event. And then let's use a lambda function here. So that's an empty function that's going to return nothing. And now what I can do in my on button save method is post an event. And then we're going to pass it a string. Let's say save button clicked, like so. So the dialog is going to result in the post event function to do nothing. The only thing we need to do in the main file is pass the post event function I defined here to my worst path class initializer. So post event equals post event. And this we're going to need to import like so. And then this is a show save button equals. There we go. So let's run this again. And now you see we get an alert. Hey, do you want to share usage statistics with us? So yes, I do want to do that. But I see we currently have disabled the save button. So in our Growthbook interface, let's first enable that. So we're going to enable the save button again. And now I'm going back into running my code. And now you see we have the save button again. So I type something and then I press save. And as you can see, we get the log message that is going to send an event save button clicked to Mixpanel. I can save this, tick, 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 tick. I can click this a couple of times like so. Mixpanel then gives you insight into that data that has been sent. So this is the web interface of Mixpanel. Again, I'm not going to dive into all the details. I think that's a bit too much in this video, just going to show you a starting point. But you see that there is events here. So there is a save button clicked event. That's the one that I created in my application. And you can see that, well, today I've clicked it 15 times until now. And you can track per day or per month or whatever you like to do. You can track the value and then you can take action depending on that. So the combination of using Growthbook to define your feature flags and Mixpanel to track usage information is really helpful. And this kind of tracking and experimenting can help you improve your application a lot because you're directly getting feedback about how users are using your app. I hope you enjoyed this overview of how to add feature flags and A/B testing to your application. If you did, give it a like, consider subscribing to my channel. You might also be interested in this video where I show you how to build an application like this and deploy it to the cloud using a technique called infrastructure as code. It's really interesting. Thanks for watching and take care.